Well, folks, we're back with another big March of the Lich King card review here. We got a ton of neutral cards in this one. So many, including one of the craziest legendaries I've ever seen here with Bone Lord, Frost Whisperer, who's 6 mana, 6/6 undead. Death Rattle for the rest of the game. Your first card each turn costs 0. What? But you also die in 3 turns. So this is giving you this really busted effect, a crazy cost discount, and it's giving you a clock. If you don't win the game using this cost discount soon enough, you're dead. I don't think you die in real life, maybe just in the game. But this is a cool card. It's a crazy, race against time here with Frost Whisper, but it's a scary card, I think, too, because we've seen cost discounts do absolutely nutty things in Hearthstone. Anytime you make big stuff cost 0, things tend to get broken. And yeah, you could play a 0 cost Denathrius right after this if you want. You play a 0 cost Bran into a Denathrius. You'd have to be at 10 mana for that one, but the possibilities there exist. You can do things like play a 0 mana Galvangar in Warrior and then do some crazy copies with Faceless Manipulators and stuff like that deck already does, but just having a 0 mana Galvangar to kick it off, even crazier. I saw somebody posting like an Alakir the Windlord Rockbiter weapon and Criminal Lineup combo, that new big spell that copies minions for a bunch of like Wind Fury 6 damage Alakirs hitting you for 12 each. So like those are just a few day one examples that probably aren't even the best examples of ways to break this card and do some crazy OTKs and silly things. And I think there's going to be a deck or two that figures out some way to abuse this and do something busted. 0 mana is just so insane. Now that said, of course, when you're building your deck around, say, like a single card enabler like this for your combo, that can be hard to find. You're not always necessarily going to have the combo or have this in hand, or sometimes it's going to get silenced off. So you are exposing that build to a lot of risk inherent to this card, both from a delayed draw standpoint. You may not hit it, and then the opponent silences it or something. You're kind of screwed. So that could keep some decks in check that aren't consistent otherwise or don't have ways to win without Frost Whisper, but I still think this is just so swingy, and the free mana here is potentially so significant that somebody's going to figure this out, and this card's going to feel broken in some deck or another. I think this looks really, really scary. So next up here, we have a bunch of undead cards, neutral undead, like this crazy one, the Plague Spreader, a 4 mana 4/4 undead, Death Rattle, transform a random minion in your opponent's hand into a Plague Spreader. So this is just going to go on board. It's a 4/4. You're not super excited about that. Obviously, that's pretty weak stat line for 4 mana. But if you're looking to disrupt things, if you're looking to eat a Sire Denathrius, for instance, get a chance to remove one of their powerful minions in hand, Plague Spreader might give you a nice extra way to do that while perhaps playing into some otherwise undead synergies. Because this dies off, it's going to transform maybe that Denathrius into a Plague Spreader. Now, interestingly, of course, your opponent can play that Plague Spreader and then transform a minion in your hand into a Plague Spreader, but presumably a deck that's running this doesn't care about that as much. In fact, they might prefer having an extra Plague Spreader to, again, disrupt something else of their opponents. If they're just happy to play lots of undead bodies and disrupt cards, that's not bad. I don't think this will exist as a card you see everywhere in decks, because, with Theatars, with Mutanus, with these other disruption cards, you're hoping that you net a disruption advantage, and you might have your own Denathrius still. You have your own key cards you care about. So some decks won't be able to run this because they fear the retribution of the Plague Spreader. They fear the spread of the plague. But other decks might be okay with that, where they don't necessarily have any key cards in hand. They just have a bunch of undead stuff, maybe an Unholy Death Knight or something, and then just dropping this into the deck as a way to get a little extra disruption. I don't think that's out of line. I think we could see that in a deck here and there. This might be one of those fringe cards that just adds an extra layer of disruption in certain metas. May not need to be there all the time. Depends on how many cards like that need to be disrupted. But I wouldn't count this guy out. This is a pretty neat design, I think. So next up here, we have the Umbral Geist, a 2 mana 3/1 undead with Death Rattle, add a random shadow spell to your hand. So a little bit of a random value generator here. And typically we don't love random value generators. We like discover value generators because you're going to get to pick what you need in a given moment. This is a card that is very unpredictable, inconsistent, isn't necessarily going to align with a particular game plan you're running. There is one interesting thing here, is that it gives shadow spells to classes that don't have them, which can be interesting for like a Dawngrasp hero card, replaying it, for instance, or maybe a multicaster if you need extra card draw. I don't think that's probably going to be incentive enough for the Umbral Geist to get played often. I still think the random inconsistency here is going to hurt this one more than most decks are willing to tank that inconsistency. So probably still not a card we see a lot, but it does have that interesting little hook at least to keep in mind. Moving on to the Drakari Embalmer. This guy's artwork is like really like dark and gritty for Hearthstone. I love it. It's a 3-mana 3/4 undead. He's got a battle cry, give a friendly undead reborn. So we've got reborn keyword stuff here. We've got undead synergies here. We've got a, vanilla stat line for the Drakari Embalmer. I think this is okay. It's one of those things like, okay, I get it. I'm creating corpses maybe. I'm getting some undeads to stick around on board. I've got this like sticky token plan going. Ultimately though, I mean, it's okay. And I don't think okay cards get there these days in Hearthstone. I mean, I've seen so many other great ways to summon lots of sticky stuff in Death Knight in particular. I still don't really believe that an undead swarm deck is coming together in its own right. I think it needs some other kind of game plan or package to support it. I mean, yes, all of this kind of plays to infuse, but still demanding specifically undead synergies is a limitation for all of these. So I don't really think the Embalmer's good enough to like inspire inclusion in a deck. It's just totally fine and totally fair. Next up is the Banshee, a 1-mana 2/1 undead with Death Rattle, give a random friendly undead +2/+1. Here we have another undead synergy kind of zoo style card, and the idea here, you play this on 1, opponent doesn't kill it, you follow it up turn 2 undead and trade this in or something, and you're trading up these stats. And 2/1 buff's not bad for 1 mana. That's a nice little buff if this all works out well, but I think ultimately the awkwardness here is going to be higher than you expect. It's going to be hard to line this up and actually get a good buff out of it most of the time. Your opponent's just going to ping it off, or they're going to kill it last. You won't always have great trades for it. It demands undead specifically, so it's kind of limiting its use cases right off the bat. All in all, I just don't think this zoo undead thing comes together. And if it does, it's going to be unholy Death Knights that have more specific game plan cards that kind of achieve this game plan better than these neutrals. They do feel a little bit more like filler to me. Moving on to the Foul Egg here, a new 1-mana 0/2 undead egg. And the egg itself is undead, which is pretty interesting. It's a Death Rattle summon a 3/3 undead chicken. His name is the Foul. That's amazing. And you know what? 1-mana 3/3 there is not bad. And in particular, that's better than some of the other egg cards we've seen, I think, because it's just so cheap to get the egg down. And the fact that these are both undead, I mean, that's promising. I like egg cards in general. They offer neat opportunities to get a sticky, guaranteed sort of board. And, we've got stuff now like the Banshee that can perhaps buff the Foul Egg if it's sticking around. Like, you kind of see this game plan coming together a little, but ultimately, I still just think it's too fair. These cards are just kind of stat dumps on board. True zoo decks of sorts like that don't really work anymore. You need really specific, powerful cards to exploit these synergies. If you think about like Imp Warlock, for instance, crazy big buffs, crazy big card draw. All of this just feels a little bit more honest in comparison when you look at these sort of undead synergies. That said, the Foul Egg here to me has a little more potential because of its stickiness, because of the sort of friction it creates as an egg card that tends to find a home here and there in Hearthstone. So I'm going to give this a slightly higher score than a lot of these other undead cards that I just don't see getting there. Next up is the Infectious Ghoul, a 5-mana 5/4 undead with Death Rattle, give a random friendly minion Death Rattle, summon an Infectious Ghoul. So this is kind of like a Greybow, if you remember Greybow for Druid, but it doesn't have Taunt, and I think that's actually a really big pain point for this card. The taunt on Greybow was really nice. Number one, it gave you like some defensive utility, when you played it. Your opponent is like, okay, I got to get through this taunt, so you might get a little reprieve from minion attacks, which this will not do. If they want to go face, they can just ignore the Infectious Ghoul stuff altogether. But also the taunt forced the opponent to sometimes activate the Death Rattle. Like this case, they, again, don't have to. If they have a board full of 3/3s, you could play this and not be able to kill it off and not realize any Death Rattle value for a long time, whereas Greybow could initiate that action for you and start creating that Death Rattle chain that forced the opponent to interact. So, I mean, Greybow was, a solid card. Didn't really get a ton of constructed play. It's been better in things like duels. We've had a lot of fun with it. But I think the Infectious Ghoul is actually even worse than Greybow in an era that's later than Greybow, and I just don't see this one coming together very well. Like, yes, it is a lot of value. I'm gonna have fun playing this card as a kind of greedy value card, I'm sure, with Death Rattle shenanigans. But as far as the constructed Hearthstone deck is concerned, I just don't see it getting there. Moving on to the Brittle Skin Zombie, a 3-mana 4/3 undead. Death Rattle, if it's your opponent's turn, deal 3 damage to them. So we got ourselves a little conditional leper gnome sort of effect here. We've seen some 3-mana 4/3s in the past, like for Priest, that just had this Death Rattle that just went off and dealt the damage. You didn't need this conditionality of it being on your opponent's turn. That card wasn't great. I don't really see this card being great either. I don't think 3 damage here is enough. I do understand the mechanic. Yes, it's nice that if they don't kill it, you've got a 4/3 that can attack. If they do kill it, you get 3 damage. But ultimately, I don't think that 3 damage goes far enough, especially in a Ridithal world these days. So Brittle Skin Zombie just falls a little too short. Moving on here to the Shatter Skin Gargoyle, a 6-mana 4/6 undead. A little bit bigger this time around. Taunt and Death Rattle deal 4 damage to a random enemy. So we've had a few of these like bomb style cards lately dealing damage, but they're often best when you can direct that damage to a specific target. And here I think both the damage number is a little too small at 4, and the inability to direct it to something you care about is going to hurt this one too from a consistency standpoint. If you're playing a 4/6 taunt, you might actually prefer the Shatter Skin Gargoyle hits a minion instead of face. But you might accidentally hit face sometimes, and ultimately this taunt's just not big enough to me. I don't think this Death Rattle synergy is significant enough. When we compare this even to like an Undying Disciple available for Priest, that's a 6-mana taunt that gets played that's way better at doing its job. And yes, that's specific to Priest, of course. This being neutral might get played by other classes, but I don't think so. I just don't think the power level here is high enough to keep up or compare when that is such a good fit and has like Death Rattle synergies in Priest, and it's still not even an amazing card, it's just solid. Then Shatter Skin Gargoyle, I just don't see how a deck can utilize this well enough to feel good. So next up here is the Vrykul Necrolite, a 2-mana 2/2 undead. Battlecry, give a friendly minion Death Rattle, summon a 2/2 zombie with Rush. So, you know, there's actually quite a few nice things going on here. You got 2-mana 4/4. You got Rush on the zombie, which that's always a nice little bonus to have. They didn't have to add that in, I'd say. So this does feel efficient in a lot of ways, and that makes me take a closer look at this card. That said, I still worry about a couple things. You know, there is the empty board problem with something like this, where if you don't have a card on board, this just feels so stuck in hand. Or if you don't have the mana to play one alongside it quite yet, it's going to feel weird. You know, suddenly it's like, oh, okay, I got a 3-drop in the Vrykul. Okay, I'm playing that on turn 5. Is the 2/2 that exciting on 5? No, I really wish I could have played this on turn 2, but my 1-drop didn't stick, or I missed my 1-drop, and it's like, okay, this is already creating all these little awkward lines and turns that don't feel all that good. Now, it is nice that this is just a friendly minion and not an undead minion, which a lot of these cards have had that really specific, narrow undead requirement. This doesn't, which I think opens it up a little bit, but ultimately still, I don't think this is quite synergistic enough. Decks that are looking for an aggro swarm game plan are probably going to have better tools than this on average. I don't think this is as bad as some of the other neutral cards we've seen. This has a little more promise to me, but still probably not enough to actually make the cut in a deck. Moving on to the Nerubian Vizier here. It's a 3-mana 2/4 undead with Battlecry, discover a spell. If a friendly undead died after your last turn, it costs 2 less. So, you know, honestly, at a base level, sometimes these little 3-mana discover a spell cards have worked out okay. Sometimes like Ridithal decks, sometimes just control decks need these sort of tools. They just got to have ways to fill mana and find stuff to do later. So I don't totally hate this at a base level. It's not great, but it's okay. And then if you got this upside, if you are playing this in a deck with some undead, that 2-mana discount is actually fairly significant. You can set up some swingy spells, you know, get a 6-mana spell, reduce it to 4 kind of thing, and play it next turn. You could see some exciting lines there. So I think this is more interesting than a lot of our other undead cards. Now, it's one of those questions like, if undead are all swarmy and early game and aggro, how often is this actually going to activate? Is a deck that's running a lot of undeads for the consistency you're going to care as much about discovering the random spell? There are some fit questions there that I have, but I wouldn't be totally shocked to see this pop into a more, you know, late game Ridithal style deck that does have some sort of undead focus. So one of the Death Knights, you know, that just happens to have enough undead lying around, the Vizier pops in and makes a nice little home for itself. I don't think that'll be super common, but definitely a playable looking card here for me. So next up here is the Arms Dealer, a 1-mana 1/2 undead. After you summon an undead, give it +1 attack. Now this is summon, not play, so there are some things that are interesting here, perhaps with like Death Knight, with some of the multiple minion summons there. If you're getting 3 or 4 things at once, this is a pretty low overhead way to give them +1 attack. I think the question is +1 attack significant enough to make this really worth it? Just, you know, it's not cost a lot at 1 mana, but you have to run the card. It's taking up that slot in your deck. there's that opportunity cost there. Could you just have something that's, you know, a more aggressive 1-drop or a stickier card or adds some health or survivability to your board somehow? Whereas this +1 attack, you know, that's probably not going to be realized very often actually hitting anything, because if you make a big wide board, it's just going to get AoE'd very often, that sort of thing. Often we like attack that's a follow-up, a post-hoc attack, so that once things have stuck, you can do lots of big damage. This preemptive based attack is often less likely to actually connect. So, I mean, you know, this does a lot. It has the potential to hit multiple minions. All of that's great. I think ultimately just not sure it packs quite enough punch. And I don't know if this is something you love on curve necessarily either. You're just kind of hitting a 2-drop and maybe a 3-drop if you're lucky. I don't think that really adds up for enough either. So for me, I think the Arms Dealer probably gets skipped on just because you'd rather run a big threatening 1-drop if you can. I mean, even just a 2/2 over this might ultimately net you more attack in total than the upside on this effect. But at least it's doing something kind of new and different, and the artwork is, of course, very funny. Moving on to the Tenacious Sandlane, a 5-mana 4/6 undead with lifesteal, and whenever this attacks, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. So a little bit of extra lifesteal potential there, a little bit of chip damage potential. Ultimately, though, for a 5-mana card, I think that's way too much commitment. These kind of lifesteal stat stick sort of cards in the mid game have never really worked before, and I think they're less likely to work nowadays than ever before. And I don't think the heal upside here is nearly significant enough for the delay on the heal, the potential for it to just get removed without doing anything. It's not going to stick around often. Maybe a fine arena card, I'm sure, but for standard constructed Hearthstone, I just don't think this one makes any sense. Next up is the Incorporeal Corporal. That is a fun name to say. A 2-mana 5/5 undead. After this minion attacks, destroy it. So a couple ways I think to use this. Number one, you could just still play this in an aggro deck and say, hey, look, I know this guy's gonna die, but I'm gonna get a 5 attack to face, or maybe take a really great trade with my 2-mana minion. Alternatively, you could play this in like a silence deck. We've seen some silence priest stuff where you silence off this downside and you've just got a 2-mana 5/5. And then maybe even like in an old handlock style, you give this taunt. It doesn't need to attack as long as it's a body on board. So a few angles for the Incorporeal Corporal here. I think the Silence Priest angle is actually the most interesting and most likely to succeed, although still very unlikely to succeed. We've got the like Whispers of the Deep card that silences and deals damage based on the attack. That could be a good tool in the early game. Get the 5/5 down, wipe your opponent's board with basically like a minefield kind of thing that only hits them. And then, you know, you're rolling from there in a Silence Priest deck. I still think that's very fringe, very, very unlikely, but it is intriguing. I don't think aggro decks will be able to use this. I think a lot of the upside in early high pressure minions is that they remain a persistent threat. They demand resources, they demand mana from your opponent. And a 5/5 that dies on its own doesn't demand any of that. It's just going to go away. So I don't think aggro decks use this, but the sneaky stuff, maybe. Very unlikely, but a possibility. So finally here we have the Flesh Behemoth, a 9-mana 4/8 with Taunt and Death Rattle. Draw another undead and summon a copy of it. So a couple important words here. Note the another. This will not actually hit a Flesh Behemoth. I guess they don't want this chaining into multiple Flesh Behemoths. Particularly, there's like ways to add a bunch of these into your deck or something, like Togwaggle scheme, I guess, in Wild. You know, you could have like an infinite chain almost of Flesh Behemoths, more or less. So it's another undead. Also, it summons a copy of it, so you're not losing your value here. You're also going to have that undead in hand, so that can be important to make sure you have enough value. That said, I still don't really think this is going to come together. It demands some really specific deck building, like only big undead minions. That might be hard to achieve. There's really not that many great ones right now. Of course, more could get printed, but ultimately, the 4/8 aspect on the Flesh Behemoth here doesn't feel quite big enough to me. 9 mana feels like a pretty expensive overhead to get this all started. So I don't think this is going to be a great enabler for any kind of big undead deck. I think this will probably fall too far short. Although maybe Druid has a tiny chance here with some of these Death Rattle synergies they've been stacking up. Bone Lord Frost Whisper is a 5-star card. Banshee is a 2-star card. Foul Egg is a 3-star card. Umbralgeist is a 2-star card. Flesh Behemoth is a 2-star card. Infectious Ghoul is a 2-star card. Brittleskin Zombie is a 1-star card. Shatterskin Gargoyle is a 1-star card. Vrykul Necrolite is a 2-star card. Nerubian Vizier is a 3-star card. Plague Spreader is a 3-star card. Arms Dealer is a 2-star card. Tenacious Sandlane is a 1-star card. Drakari Embalmer is a 2-star card. Incorporeal Corporal is a 2-star card. Incorporeal Corporal is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. Lots of neutral cards. Man, you know, review scores a little low on these. That's kind of to be expected, though. Typically, we have a ton of neutrals in any given set that don't get a lot of play. Things that are just kind of, you know, 2 or 3 cards will pop in here and there and be relevant, but a lot of filler stuff that's maybe designed more for like arena modes than standard. But that said, Bone Lord Frostwhisper, I think this card's really, really frightening. The potential here is kind of nuts. So what do you guys think? Is this card actually insane? Is it OP? Is it gonna backfire too often? Are any of these neutral cards actually gonna make the cut and be powerful cards? I want to hear all those thoughts and more in the comments below. But until then, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.